I'm Safira. Do you remember when you were new to Final Fantasy XIV and some mechanics make you panic and got either yourself or others killed? Most of us have had moments like that, so in this video, I decided to include some of those common fight mechanics in Final Fantasy XIV. I'm only including mechanics that appear in normal content and not those that are staples in extreme and savage content, as there are more than enough of them to constitute a video of their own. Here are 10 common fight mechanics that catch new players by surprise. A quick reminder that if you find this video useful, please like, comment, and subscribe. I have also launched Patreon and Ko-fi where you can support my content. More on this at the end of the video. Number 1. Stack Marker. This mechanic goes by many names, but the core mechanic is the same. One or more players will be marked with pulsing arrows pointing towards themselves. If only one player is within the stack marker when the effect activates, it can kill them in one hit. In order to resolve the mechanic properly, the player will need to stack with other players in order to share the damage and survive it. There are some variations to the stack marker, such as multiple stack markers on multiple players. In this situation, you must make sure to separate the stack markers and split up players into groups to spread the damage. If the stack markers overlap, there will be too much damage for players to survive. Another variation of the stack marker is when there are multiple hits that land on whoever got the marker. An example of this is Agmon, which does 4 consecutive hits on the stack. A common mistake players make is to leave the stack early, which can lead to deaths. The line stack marker is another version of this mechanic, where players must stack in a line. This means they can be either in front of or behind the marker as long as they're still in the line and are sharing damage. Number 2. Doom. This one is less a mechanic and more of a debuff on the player. The debuff will typically have a countdown timer on it, and unless certain conditions are met, the player will die when the timer ends. There are various ways a player can get Doom, as well as various ways to remove the debuff depending on the mechanic. One of the ways the debuff can be cleansed is if there are lit up tiles in the arena, and all the player needs to do is to step on the tiles in order to remove Doom. The tiles usually move around, which can cause new players to miss them and die to the debuff. If the Doom debuff has a white bar on top of the debuff symbol, then it can simply be removed using Esuna from a healer. Doom can also be a trigger for a heal check, where the player must be healed to full HP in order to remove the debuff. Number 3. Acceleration Bomb. This mechanic, like many other mechanics on this list, also goes by different names. It has a countdown timer and requires the player to be absolutely still when the timer ends, else they suffer damage. In order to resolve the mechanic safely, the player must not be moving, using an ability or skill, or auto-attacking when the countdown reaches 0. There is another mechanic that is very similar to Acceleration Bomb called Pyretic. Pyretic also has a timer and requires the player to stay still. The major difference between Acceleration Bomb and Pyretic is that the player must do no action for a few seconds when Pyretic's timer ends, or they will suffer damage for every action they take until the debuff goes away. I would also like to make a special mention to a mechanic that is the opposite of Pyretic, Defreeze. This mechanic requires the player to be actively doing an action, like moving or jumping, when the timer ends, or else they will get frozen and suffer damage. Number 4. Earthshakers. A number of players will get a unique marker above their heads with tethers going to each player. Earthshakers does conal AoE damage in the direction of each player. Therefore, the players must spread out in order to not stack the AoEs and resolve the mechanic by taking the appropriate amount of damage. Number 5. Gaze. Number 5. Gaze, also known as the look-away mechanic. The mechanic requires you to look away from the enemy, regardless of where you are on the map to avoid being hit. The tell for this is always a large red eye marker on the enemy. It is one of the most common mechanics in Final Fantasy XIV, although the result of failing to look away when the cast goes off can be any number of status effects depending on the enemy. A less common variation of this mechanic is a localized gaze with a telegraphed AoE where the player can avoid the mechanic by staying out of the AoE instead of looking away. Number 6. Rotating AoE. This mechanic is usually used by bosses. The boss will rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise while shooting AoE out in front of them. In some version of this mechanic, there will be a visual marker with a series of arrows indicating the direction of the rotation. Players will then have to rotate in the same direction while avoiding the AoE. In some cases, there will be no indication of the direction of the rotation, so when there is no telegraph, it's usually best to stand behind the boss and watch which way the rotation is. Number 7. Tower. This mechanic can come in many different forms, but the core mechanic is the same. There will be a marked area in the arena where one or more players must stand in, usually to avoid big raid-wide damage. The tower mechanic usually only requires a minimum of one player to soak it. There are variations that require different numbers of players to stand in them. When this happens, there will be indicators to signify the number of players required. Number 8. Knockback. Players will get pushed back away from the mechanic's point of origin. There are several variations of this mechanic. One variation that is easy to spot is when there will be moving arrows covering the whole arena, indicating where the push will happen. Players will simply need to stand close to the side of the arena where the arrows are coming from to solve this mechanic. Another variation of this mechanic is where the indicator is a circular AoE that looks like water is overflowing from the center of the AoE. The AoE can appear anywhere on the arena depending on the fight, and players must be careful about where they stand in relation to the AoE in order to get knocked back safely. The knockback mechanic can also appear as a water sprout on one side of the arena, where it will transform into a wave and knock back all players across the platform. To solve the knockback mechanic, players can choose to get knocked back to safety or to use Surecast or Arm's Length in order to negate the knockback effect. Number 9. Proximity. As the name suggests, this is a mechanic that deals damage depending on how close the player is to the marker. The indicator is usually a red circle with red pulses emanating from it, the color of which will fade out the further it gets from the marker, signifying the distance the players need to get away from the marker. Some fights can have multiple markers appearing at the same time, so that the players will have to figure out which part of the arena is furthest away from all the markers. A mechanic that is very similar to proximity is flare. For flare, a player will get the flare marker signaling other players to move away from them to reduce the proximity damage. Similar to proximity, more than one player can also get the flare markers, meaning that players must arrange themselves around the arena to minimize the damage. Number 10. Duty Action. Duty actions are special buttons that appear in certain duties. The actions themselves are not a mechanic, but players must use them to resolve mechanics in the game. The duty action will appear as different actions depending on the duty the player is in, and must be used according to the special mechanics of each duty. Since it appears as a single separate button, it can be easy to miss and new players may not know what it is used for. And there you have it. 10 common fight mechanics in Final Fantasy XIV that can be difficult to understand by new players. Hopefully this will help some of you from spending half the fights on the floor like I did in my earlier days, as well as with the upcoming Endwalker expansion. As I have announced at the start of the video, I have launched a Patreon where you can become a member to support my content at patreon.com/SaphiraMorwin. You can gain bonuses like director's commentary and other behind-the-scenes stories in making the videos. You can also buy me a coffee to support me in making more videos at coffee.com/Saphira. Thank you to everyone for watching until the end. And that's it from me for now. Bye!